Hello, class. We're getting toward the end of the semester and up into the 1980s now. And today's lecture will be on Ronald Wilson Reagan, the 41st President of the United States. And it'll focus a lot on the Reagan era, his 2 terms as president from 1981 through 89. Ronald Reagan was born in 1911, and he grew up relatively poor. Moved around quite a bit, mostly living in small towns in Illinois. He was the son of an alcoholic father and a hardworking seamstress mother, and his father worked as well, but was not a terribly effective breadwinner. Reagan graduated from high school in Dixon, Illinois, a small Illinois town. He was handsome and athletic and highly personable, captain of his high school football team, and then and class president in high school, and then student body president at Eureka College, a small college in Illinois. Following college, Reagan worked as a radio sportscaster in Iowa before heading to Hollywood. In Hollywood, Reagan found quick and lasting success, making 53 films between 1937 and 53, and became a leading B-movie actor, and earned a very good living doing that. Highly regarded by his fellow actors, Reagan headed the Screen Actors Guild, a union, an actors union, twice, first between 1947 and 1952, and then again from 1959 through 1960. Very concerned that communists were trying to take over Hollywood during the mid and late 1940s, Reagan informed secretly to the FBI on suspected communists in Hollywood, informed to J. Edgar Hoover. Still a strong New Deal Democrat, however, Reagan voted for Harry Truman in 1948, but moved rightward politically during the 1950s. Between 1954 and 1962, Reagan hosted the Sunday evening television program General Electric Theater, and became nationally quite well known through that. He formally became a Republican in 1962 and gave a widely noticed speech for Barry Goldwater, the Republican nominee, in 1964. Conservatives around the nation noticed and backed his run for California governor in 1966. Reagan won a second term in 1970. He was an outstanding public speaker and storyteller throughout his career. By the late 1960s, he was the leading conservative politician in the country. Unlike Goldwater, Reagan was a happy conservative, with a message that could appeal to the broad public. In the late 1970s, Reagan was the beneficiary of a resurgent brand of conservatism powered by the so-called New Right. Comprised of conservative Catholics and Protestant religious conservatives who opposed abortion and the decline of traditional values, libertarians who wanted lower taxes and a much smaller federal government, and anti-communists who thought that Presidents Nixon, Ford, and Carter had all gone soft on the Soviets. The New Right had developed highly effective means of mobilizing its base and an effective politics. Massive direct mail campaigns proved a particularly effective weapon in the hands of the New Right. And Reagan was the darling of this political movement, the New Right. In 1980, he defeated George H.W. Bush, the establishment GOP candidate, in the primaries, and then unseated President Carter in the general election. Running against Carter's mismanagement, as president, the evils of government and liberalism more generally, and also promising to renew America, Reagan won in November by a wide margin. One interesting group that he won over was the so-called Reagan Democrats, and these were blue-collar workers, many of whom had traditionally voted Democrat, but whom, with the difficult economy in 1980 and Reagan's message of American renewal and the espousal of traditional values, flocked to Reagan in droves. Think of conservative Catholic working people from places like Youngstown, Ohio, and Pittsburgh. And the Reagan Democrats would be a key to Reagan's political success throughout the 80s. Ronald Reagan was very likely the most consequential American president since FDR and up to the current day. As president, he liked to keep things simple. He didn't want to overload Congress or the public with too many items. And throughout his political career, and particularly as president, Reagan focused primarily on three things. Number one, cutting taxes. He was always passionate about the need to cut taxes. Number two, building up the military. And number three, winning, and he made no mistake in the way he said this, winning the Cold War and defeating the Soviet Union, which he labeled the evil empire. In terms of his management style, Reagan was quite hands-off. Critics charged that he was disengaged. His style was highly delegatory. He liked to give a broad vision and then let his aides go out and implement, and he had faith in his aides to implement. He did not micromanage, so unlike his predecessor, President Jimmy Carter, who was known to micromanage to the extent that he would check who was signed up to play on the White House tennis courts that day and manage that situation, Reagan was the opposite of that. He didn't, as they might say, sweat the small stuff. He was our oldest president to that date. He was 69 when he assumed office, and he did not have the energy that, let's say, an FDR or a JFK or a Teddy Roosevelt had, and he often took afternoon naps and made jokes about that. He had a very good sense of humor. As a rule, Reagan focused on his priorities and trusted his aides, and really didn't worry too much about the small details. Some would say he was uninterested, really, in the details of things that weren't passions of his, like the environment or social welfare issues. Reagan was tremendously optimistic about America. He had a faith and optimism in the United States of America that was quasi-religious. He often talked of America as being a shining city on a hill, echoes of of the Puritan leader John Winthrop there, and a shining beacon to people everywhere. And he hearkened back to the spirit of the Eisenhower, Kennedy, and early Johnson years, in his attitude that there was nothing that Americans couldn't do if they set their minds to it. Unlike JFK and LBJ, however, Reagan, a conservative, had little faith in the government to solve problems, famously saying that government is the problem, and preferring to rely on private initiative to solve problems, except when it came to defense, where he relied heavily on the public sector. Many Americans found Reagan's faith in the country reassuring, a good antidote to the dispirited and cynical feelings of the 1970s and to the malaise of the Carter years. Reagan's presidency began in January of 1981 And his top priority, legislative priority for that year, was major tax cut legislation that he had proposed. But he was shot early that year. He was shot and almost killed. The bullet passed very near his heart. He was shot on March 30th, 1981 in Washington, D.C. by a deranged would-be assassin named John Hinckley. But Reagan recovered well and rather quickly, and displayed remarkably good spirits and calm throughout the entire ordeal. And of course, the public rallied to him. A wounded leader, the public rallied to him in that time. Rather amazingly, Reagan made an effective speech to Congress and the nation less than a month after he was shot. He made that speech on April the 28th. And he lobbied hard and effectively with individual congressmen for passage of the legislation. The tax cuts passed in August, largely in an unchanged form from the bill that Reagan and Republican congressional leaders had written. These were the biggest tax cuts in American history. High-income Americans particularly benefited, with the top marginal rates decreasing from 70 to 50%. Right after passage of the tax cut legislation, the PATCO strike hit. And this was a group of federal employees who were unionized, the Air Traffic Controllers Union. And Reagan believed that the strike was illegal, and he issued an ultimatum giving the PATCO workers 48 hours to return to work, or else he threatened to terminate their employment. True to his word, Reagan fired the 11,000 controllers who did not return to work after 48 hours. And this was roughly 62% of the air traffic controllers. And then he used Army members of the Army to work as traffic controllers in the interim. This was a highly symbolic sort of Western movie, high noon encounter, if you will. The president didn't blink and stuck to his guns, and the move was extremely, his actions in this instance were extremely popular with the American people. Nonetheless, the economic recession that Reagan had inherited upon taking office continued throughout 1981, 82, and into 1983. And the massive tax cuts did not end the recession, as conservatives had predicted they would, at least not in 81 and 82. Unemployment remained extremely high at 9.7%. It was the highest since the Great Depression. And the Democrats gained in the midterm elections, adding 26 seats to their House majority. Reagan's approval rating remained below 50% for much of 82 and 83. At this time, tensions with the Soviet Union, which Reagan had labeled the evil empire, reached the greatest heights that they had reached since the early 1960s. Fears of a nuclear war were widespread in the U.S. at the time. Many college applicants wrote essays on the subject of fear of nuclear annihilation. And in Western Europe, when the U.S. deployed new medium-range nuclear missiles, there were massive protests against Reagan. In terms of defense and foreign policy, true to his campaign promises, President Reagan pushed hard for big increases in defense spending, and he got them. Reagan had famously responded to a query about defense spending by saying, "You spend what you need." Between 1981 and 1985, annual defense spending increased by 34%, from $171 billion to $229 billion per year. A good chunk of this was spent on Reagan's pet project, the Strategic Defense Initiative, which was labeled Star Wars by its critics, and which two of Reagan's top defense aides, Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger and Secretary of State George Shultz, both strongly opposed as impractical. Long viscerally appalled by the idea of nuclear war, Reagan was shocked upon becoming president to learn that the U.S. had no way of stopping Soviet nukes once they were fired at the mainland of the U.S. And in fact, that all of our capability was offensive, all of our nuclear capability. Reagan gave strong backing to this expensive effort, SDI, to build a missile shield for the United States, hoping in the process to dissuade the Soviets from ever launching an attack, and also hoping to spend them into oblivion if they tried to keep up with the spending of our much bigger and more productive economy and build their own nuclear shield. Reagan had long wanted to work on nuclear arms reduction with the Soviets, but until the ascension of a new young leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, in 1985, he had lacked a willing partner in the Soviet hierarchy. Gorbachev represented a new brand of leader and a new generation of leader in the Soviet Union. He was a reformer, and he was only 54 years old when he took power in 1985. Reagan and Gorbachev quickly established a good working relationship and proceeded to make historic arms limitation and reduction agreements throughout the remainder of Reagan's second term, culminating in the December 1987 INF Treaty that reduced both sides' intermediate and short-range nuclear missiles in Europe, over the stern objections of more realistic Cold Warriors on both sides, including Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger, both of whom strongly opposed Reagan's efforts with Gorbachev as being unsafe and unrealistic. Let's pause it there, and I'll come back in a minute.